Good morning, everybody, and welcome to our Extranet User Manager webinar on Azure B2B and Office 365. My name is Peter Carson. I'm the president of Envision IT, and I'm going to be your presenter for the next hour. I'm also a SharePoint MVP and a partner seller with Microsoft Canada. All of my contact information is up on the slide there, and we will be sharing the slide deck after the session as well as a recording. So if you have colleagues who weren't able to join us, by tomorrow we should have the recording up on our site. You'll be able to pull that down on demand. Also on the line with me, I've got Denesh Sohan, who's our Director of Products. He'll be watching to see if there's questions as we're going through and answer those as we're going through. So feel free to post your questions up into the GoToWebinar as you're working through that. And we also have Logan Guest, who's in charge of sales from a further discovery, setting up a trial, getting a one-on-one demo set up. Logan's your guy from that point of view. Connect up with him and he'd be more than happy to work with you on that. All right, so let's start with a quick agenda. We're going to begin with a very brief background on Extranet, just to level set everybody. And then we're going to dive right into Azure Active Directory B2B, which is their business-to-business service. Still in preview. It's been out for a little over a year now. It's had some fairly major revamps in the last 6 months or so, and we'll basically go through that experience using the native tool. And then we'll contrast that with Extranet User Manager, talk about some of the gaps that we see in B2B and how we fill those with Extranet User Manager, talk about the licensing, some of the governance around that, and then take you through a demo from an Office 365 point of view using the Extranet User Manager. We can wrap it up from there. Any questions we haven't answered, we'll try and answer those at the end of the session. If not, if we need to take away, we'll follow up through email after the webinar. All right, so from there, let's dive right into just a quick background on what an extranet is. So an extranet is a website who's accessible to users outside of the corporate network. So whether you've got partners, members, customers, what have you, other organizations, external to your organization that you want to share information with them or potentially collaborate with them as well. It is a secure site. It's not your public site. You need to authenticate in some way, and that's where B2B comes in. We'll talk about that in a minute. And it can be delivered in a number of different ways. It could be an extension of your public website. It could be part of your corporate intranet that you've securely exposed, or it could be a completely standalone extranet. Now we see a lot of different examples of extranet users. We've been working in this space for quite a number of years now. We have members portals, customer portals, vendors, suppliers, volunteers, donors for not-for-profits, charitable organizations, board of directors across lots of different types of organizations, citizens from government organizations, researchers, educational partners, tenants, etc. So there's a lot of different examples. Pretty much any organization that you look at, depending on, or sort of regardless of what sector, whether they're a not-for-profit, a for-profit, or a government organization, typically they don't work just within their own organization. There's a need to collaborate externally, and that's typically happened through email, maybe it's happening through Dropbox, other sort of miscellaneous ways of sharing files back and forth, and having a formal extranet is typically a much better way of managing that process. So when we first start working with organizations, some of the questions we like to ask to kind of understand what does that look like. First is really just who's coming into that extranet. If you think about the previous slide, all the different types of examples of users, it may be just one of those groups of users. There may be several different groups that are coming into the extranet. And how do those people see the information that's in the extranet? Is it private just to them? Is it a customer portal where I see my customer information but not other customers? Or is it more broadly where you're just securely publishing information out to a broad audience? Is there some sort of member database that we're going to interface in with? Maybe you're running Salesforce or Dynamics CRM from a back-end CRM perspective, and we want to connect in with that. That's something that we can do with the Extranet User Manager product. Is it strictly invitation only, where you know the people that are going to be coming in, or is there ability for people to self-register? And then what does that approval process look like? Who approves those? Is it a single group of approvers, or is there maybe some key information on the registration form itself that defines how that approval works? And is it just the extranet site? We're going to be fairly focused on SharePoint, but is there other systems, other applications that they need to single sign on into? And what does that look like? So So from a technology perspective, I mentioned we're fairly focused on SharePoint, but everything we're talking about here today is not exclusive to SharePoint. You could have an extranet that's completely outside of SharePoint, doesn't have SharePoint in there at all, and the same B2B that we're talking about here today could be applied there as well. As long as that extranet is claims aware, can delegate the authentication and federate that over to Azure AD, then you're possible to connect that up. And obviously that's easy to do from an Office 365 point of view. It can be done from an on-premise SharePoint perspective as well, and that's something that we're experimenting with as well. We're not going to talk about that today, but we're going to have an upcoming session from a hybrid extranet point of view, how you mix cloud and on-premises together. Obviously, Azure is a big part of what we're talking about today, and more specifically Azure Active Directory, and also, of course, our Extranet User Manager product. All right, so today's topic is specifically focused on Azure AD B2B. We had a webinar session last week that was more focused from an on-premises SharePoint perspective. So if you're curious to get more detail about that, by all means, the recording's available. Have a look at our event site to see that. But we're going to dive deeper into the Azure AD B2B side today. So let's talk about some of the points. Why would you want to use Azure AD B2B? Well, it is simple to use, particularly depending on the type of partner that's coming in. And we'll talk about the different user experiences depending on what type of partners are coming in. But basically, you're inviting people externally into your Azure Active Directory. Now, you're not setting up full accounts with passwords and such in your Azure AD, you're basically federating to another Azure AD for that. So they can either use an existing Azure AD account that they have, or one gets created for them through the invitation process. I'm going to take you through 3 different scenarios to kind of show you that user experience and what that looks like in those different experiences. The permissions can be managed through your Azure AD groups, and then you can apply those permissions, say, into your SharePoint Online site from there. It's secure. All access is being controlled through your Azure AD. So you can remove partners from your Azure AD and their access is remote. But also if that user on that partner organization leaves that organization and their Azure AD on their side gets shut down, they lose access there as well. And that's one of the big gaps in a lot of extranets is, it's one thing to onboard new external users. It's often quite difficult to determine when those users are no longer valid. Do they still work for that organization? In the B2B scenario, we're depending on the partner organization to do the authentication, and you can be rest assured that they're going to be quite diligent about making sure that they shut down accounts for staff that work for them that are no longer active, which effectively shuts down access into your extranet portal as well, which is what you actually want. It's quite seamless as well. That you don't need to have an Azure AD, but if you do, and you've got single sign-on and other things happening on your Azure AD side, it actually makes that sign-on process much simpler and single sign-on between different tenants. If you've worked with SharePoint Online and had multiple tenants going before, you've probably experienced the pain of having to run in private or incognito windows because you can't log in as 2 different identities. Azure AD B2B kind of resolves that because it allows you to come in with one identity into multiple tenants. Okay, so more specifically around B2B and Office 365, those partner users that you've brought into your Azure AD can then be granted access to any part of your SharePoint Online. And all the standard SharePoint permissions apply in terms of how you want to manage that. Do you want to apply permissions just to the individual user, to an Azure AD group that they belong to, or maybe put them into an Office 365 group or a SharePoint group to manage permissions that perspective? Now, all B2B users are considered external users by Microsoft. Where that becomes very important is from a licensing and subscription point of view. So you don't need to purchase additional Office 365 subscriptions for your partner users. And that's a big deal. You don't want to have to be paying $5, $10, $15 a month for each of your external users that are coming into your SharePoint farm. So that's a huge advantage to using B2B. Now, the permissions in SharePoint Online can be applied from Azure AD groups, and site owners can manage the Azure AD group membership either through Extranet User Manager or directly through the Azure AD portal. And we're going to show you both of those scenarios as we go through here. Now, I mentioned there's different experiences depending on what type of partner user you have coming in. And really the differentiator there is what type of email address do they have. If they're already an Office 365 user, or maybe they're an Azure AD already through their organization, that's the simplest experience. They basically log in with their existing Azure AD credentials to accept their invitation. They don't get a new password. There's nothing that new from an authentication perspective. In fact, if they're already logged into their own Office 365, they don't even log into your site. They just come in right through, and those credentials get passed through as part of the single sign-on. Now, let's say they do have a business email, so they're not on a a Gmail or Hotmail account. They actually have a corporate or an organizational email address, but there isn't an Azure AD account for that address. What happens is behind the scenes, Azure AD will either create the tenant if this is the first user from that email domain, or it'll create a new account if there's already a tenant there, and it'll prompt the user to create their password. They can provide some details, and if they forget their password and they need to do a password reset and such, Azure AD provides the functionality to do that. Now later, let's say that partner organization decides that they're going to go into Office 365 and spin up a full Azure AD, they can convert that tenant and bring all those accounts in. And then they can then decide, do those users continue to use the passwords that they set up? Or are they going to sync with their on-premises Active Directory passwords? Are they going to do single sign-on through ADFS? There's lots of different scenarios from that point of view. And then the third scenario is you have a consumer email. I've got a Gmail account, a Hotmail account, what have you. In this case, that account gets converted to a Microsoft account. Now, if you're using an Outlook.com or a Hotmail account, those are already inherently Microsoft accounts. But if you're using Gmail or say a telco provided consumer email domain, something like that, that needs to get converted into a Microsoft account for you to be able to complete the invitation process. And I'm going to walk you through what that actually looks like, just to give you a sense of what that user experience is like. I do want to take a quick pause here, though, and have a look at the polls. So we've got a couple of polls in here. So the first one is around experience with Azure AD. So let's just launch that out. And I want to understand, on the phone now, has anybody actually used Azure B2B before? Are you planning on using it? That's why you're here. Are you currently using Office 365, where this really has the strongest application? And even if you're not using Office 365, do you perhaps have an Azure AD organizational account? So I'll give you a minute just to answer those questions. Okay, give you a few more seconds for the last few to vote there, and then what I'll do is I'll close that and share that back with the group. All right, so a small percentage have used Azure AD B2B. I probably should have asked a different question as well, because there's two flavors. There's, of course, two Azure portals. There's the old Azure portal where you could upload CSV files and have those invitations go out from a B2B point of view. That was the original preview that went out. And then back in September at Ignite, they launched the new Azure portal features that had a much easier interface for inviting users one-on-one through there. But most folks haven't used B2B yet, so I'm assuming this will be a first glimpse at that from that point of view. Obviously, a good portion considering using Azure AD, lots of you on Office 365. In fact, everybody who's on Office 365 also has an Azure AD account under the hood as part of that. You may have one without Office 365 as well from that perspective. Okay, so that gives me a good sense of where people are at from that point of view. So let's talk about some of the limitations that we see from the current preview in Azure B2B. And things in Azure change quickly. There's new features coming in all the time. We were doing a demo just last week or the week before and noticed that the invitations have been completely redesigned in there. So things change fairly quickly in Azure, but this is basically our current state of what we see through there. The first is around delegation, and we'll talk more about this as we get into the Extranet User Manager side, but there really isn't any individual delegation to say I'm going to delegate a subset of users to somebody to manage. Ideally you want to decouple the whole onboarding process from your IT organization and delegate that down to the businesses. And it's kind of an all or nothing right now. If you delegate it to the business, they have access to all those external users, whether they belong to their part of what they're doing or not, and we can't restrict that access down. It is managed through the Azure portal, and we'll have a look at that in a minute. Azure portal is very powerful. It changes a lot, and there's a lot of information in there. So it can be a little overwhelming for business users. I find it overwhelming myself. I get lost trying to find things in there for different purposes. There is no self-registration or approval process, so it is an invitation-only process. And there's no real integration to other line of business systems. So if you want to integrate in with, say, CRM, do an extended profile, things like that, that's not supported as part of the out-of-the-box Azure AD B2B. And there's no integration to on-premises AD. There is some interesting things we're going to be talking about in a future webinar around using the Azure Application Proxy, and that allows your B2B credentials to come into your on-premises systems, whether that's an on-premise SharePoint or maybe a classic Windows authentication website that you want to bring people into. There's some interesting ideas there. But what needs to happen is you need to provision both an on-premise AD account and the B2B account, and then link those two together. The end user doesn't know or aware of the password or the credentials for that on-premise account, but the application proxy basically connects those together and fits that together. So interesting things there. Having said that, though, there are some scenarios where we see a lot of value to just using Azure B2B right out of the box. The biggest one for us as a development organization is working with development tenants. So if you've got a production Office 365 site and you're doing any sort of development in there, typically you want to have a completely separate tenant for your development work, and maybe you've got another one for test. Your individual developers may have their own developer tenants. You end up having a lot of different tenants. It gets very confusing trying to keep track of those and the credentials to use on each of those. And particularly, you don't want to create a lot of accounts in those development tenants and pay for that. Those staff that are coming in are already paying for their regular production Office 365 tenant. So typically we see one user account getting shared by multiple people in those development environments, and it gets quite confusing. So what we've done over the last year or so as B2B has matured is we now use B2B to invite in the full development and client teams. So we spin up a tenant, we have one account for that, we use Azure B2B to then invite in the other users, and they can use their regular production credentials to come into that development tenant. So there's no need for in-private browser windows, additional logins. It saves a lot of confusion from that point of view. It's just a lot more convenient to work that way. Also, though, if you've got small extranets, maybe you've got a board of directors portal, and your board of directors is a dozen or 24 people. It's not a large group of people. There's only one individual that manages that external access in. It could be reasonable to say, you know what, just use the Azure portal. A little bit of training involved to make sure that maybe the board secretary understands how to use that and manage that. But once you've done that, that works well in those sorts of scenarios. Likewise, if you're a small organization, you don't have a large number of external users, or you want to do a proof of concept, it can make a lot of sense to use the out-of-the-box B2B. Now, in order to invite users in, initially when B2B first came out, you had to be a global administrator in Azure in order to invite users in. That was a big showstopper as well. I mean, you're not going to give your board secretary global admin rights in Azure. That's going to let them do all sorts of things. They could shut down, delete, your production VMs, things like that. You generally don't want that to be happening. Now you can create what's called a guest inviter role. It's got to be done through PowerShell. I've included the sample PowerShell there. And basically you pass in the user principal name of the person that you want to be a guest inviter. You run the first 2 lines of PowerShell that adds that role to them. The third line basically does a validation to confirm that has been applied through there. And then that user can sign into the Azure portal themselves, and they don't have broad global administration rights, but they do have full rights to invite people in as guest roles through there. So that's a nice feature in terms of delegation. It is still an all or nothing. You can't subdivide what part of the users they can manage, but if the all or nothing works for you, then that applies pretty well there. Now, some other things that we need to think about is the external sharing in SharePoint Online. So if our goal here is to bring users into Office 365, we've got to turn on some sharing in order to do that. And that happens in 2 different spots in the admin console, both in the SharePoint Admin Center. So you need to be a SharePoint administrator in order to do this. The first thing is on the left-hand side, you see the link for sharing. You need to allow sharing at the tenant level. Now, the second option is the one that we tend to choose for B2B. That's allowing sharing with external users that already exist in your organization's directory. What that means is if I've invited somebody in through Azure AD B2B, they exist in my organization's directory, and I'm now going to be able to share with them in SharePoint. The third option, allow users to invite, turns on the sharing features within SharePoint itself. And you may not want to turn that on. We'll talk more about governance and why you might not want to do that and use B2B instead. And then on the right-hand side is basically answering the same question at the site collection level. So if you turn it off for the tenant, all the site collections won't have sharing working for them. It has to be turned on in the tenant, and then you have to choose which of your site collections you also want to turn it on there. So once you've done those two things, you're able to allow those external users to come in through there. So where do we manage those external users? I mentioned the new Azure portal at portal.azure.com is a spot where we come in to do that. We're in the All Users section here, and basically add a new user, enter in their information, and that'll create the invitation. And we'll go through that process and show you what that looks like. And when those users come into the Azure AD experience, we do have some flexibility to do some branding on that as well. So user experience is important. We want to be able to control what they see through there. We actually do that in the Azure AD portal as well. So we specify the company branding. There's a number of different images and logos and text copy that we can upload in there and make that visible to users that are coming into the site. So I'll show you where that is as well. All right, so with further ado, we're going to go right into the demo from an out-of-the-box Azure B2B perspective. So here's the scenario that we're going to go through. We've got a site called eumdemo.sharepoint.com. It's a SharePoint Online site in Office 365 that I want to invite people into. We're going to use the portal.azure.com to invite those users in, and we're going to take you through three different scenarios. I mentioned the three different experiences, so we're going to invite in an existing Office 365 user. I'm going to use my regular peter@envisionit.com Office 365 account. We're going to use a net new business email account that's not set up in Azure AD, and we're going to use a net new consumer email account on Gmail that hasn't been set up as a Microsoft account, so we can see what that experience looks like. Okay, so let's flip over. I'm going to be running a couple of different browsers here. So we're going to start here. So I've got my Office 365 site that I want to invite people into. And actually, just to take a second here, let's have a look at some of the site settings on here. So from a site permissions point of view, what we've done is we've created a group called _SharePoint in Azure AD. So it shows up as a domain group here, and we've given read access to that group. So anybody I put into that group will have read access to this SharePoint site. So if I come back over to Azure AD and I have a look at my Azure Active Directory, I can see my users and groups here, and we'll see what we've already got set up. So let's have a look at my all users. I've got a couple of test runs that I did through here that I want to play with. What I want to do first actually is just delete this user here because I'm going to recreate that. So let me flip over. I should have set this up beforehand. I can do a quick search of users here in Extranet User Manager. So I want to use this account later from a demo point of view. And then we'll go through that process. I think it signed my session out. Here we go. Let me just log back in again. We use Active Directory Federation services to log in, so we get a nice single sign-on. Search my users, and let's get rid of that that user there. So I'm going to set them to deactivated, and go ahead and save that. So we're going to come back to the Extranet User Manager a little later in the session. I just wanted to get things queued up properly from an Azure AD perspective first. So let's actually come back over here. So that peter@envisionit.com account is gone now. EUM has deleted that out of Azure AD. Okay, so let's go through that process of adding the three types of accounts. So the first one I want to add is the one actually that I just deleted because I want to take you through that onboarding experience. So that's my regular peter@envisionit.com account. Now you notice here when I tabbed off of username, it highlighted this and said peter@envisionit.com will be added as a guest. So it recognizes this as a domain that's external to this Azure AD, and that it's going to go through that guest invitation process. Now under groups here, I can see there's my SharePoint. So let's go ahead and select that, and I'll create that account. So it's inviting the user, and it's going to send an email invitation out to my inbox from Microsoft. We'll talk later about how we customize that email invitation process. For now, what I want to do is just set up 2 other users quickly here to take you through those different experiences. So the second one we're going to do is for a test email domain that we have that although it's set up in Azure AD now, this particular user is a brand new user that doesn't have a password in Azure AD. So that we'll see a slightly different experience through there. Still saying it's going to be added as a guest. Let's go into the groups here, go ahead and add it to the OM SharePoint group and create that account. And then my third one is a brand new Gmail account. So let me go ahead and add one more time here. Also put it in that group. Okay, so I've got my 3 invitations going out. So let's have a look at what comes through from that. So I'm going to get emails from Microsoft in each of those inboxes. Let me have a look at my first one here. Sometimes it takes a minute for those invitations to come through. My regular Peter at Envision IT hasn't shown up just yet. Oh, actually went to my clutter. Another challenge, having them go to your spam box or your clutter box instead. So I mentioned this invitation just got refreshed. This is the new look and feel here. We should be able to update the look of this. It is taking some of the branding, like it's got the Extranet User Manager logo in there, but I believe we have the ability to go further from a customization of this perspective. We just haven't delved into the depths of that just yet. Okay, so I've got a link here to get started with the invitation. I'm going to click on that. And it's going to take me to my browser window that I'm already logged into our regular Office 365 on. So this is my full production Office 365. We use it in Envision IT with my ADFS account set up with that. And here is the invitation page to go into the new site that I've been invited into. And I mentioned before, we've got the ability to add some branding into here. We put a different image on there. We can add some copy on that. And it's saying, okay, to access applications from Envision IT, I need to sign in with this account. So I hit next. It's going through a couple of login forms, but because of single sign-on, it recognizes that I'm already logged in, and it's actually going right through that process and setting up my account. So it takes a bit for the account to get provisioned, and then it's going to bring me through into the invited site from there. I like the messages, almost there. There we go. Why did it do that? You know what, sometimes this experience changes different times that I go through. Let's go to the umdemo.sharepoint.com, see what that looks like. There we go. So I'm logged in with my Peter at envisionit.com account through my corporate credentials. It's managed through Active Directory Federation Services. That's not part of this tenant at all. It's part of my production tenant. And because I'm in that EUM_SharePoint group, I now have access to this team site in SharePoint Online. So that's the experience of bringing somebody in who already has an Office 365 account. A little glitch at the end there in terms of the invitation. One of the things we're planning on doing with our Extranet User Manager product is we can actually take over that invitation process, generate that email ourselves, and have it point through and link into the proper target URL at the end of that. That's one of the challenges I should have put on the other slide, that you don't always end up in the place you expect to. Sometimes you end up in the Azure portal or other spots you don't really want to invite people into. But nevertheless, we've come through, we've now got our signed in experience from there. And if I was to close my browser down, come back in again, it would go through my organization sign-in process and take me into this site from here. So I could have many numbers of different partner sites that I'm a member of, each on their own SharePoint Online tenants, and I only use one ID to get into them. I can share that in one browser session through different tabs. I don't have to worry about logging out and logging back in through those. Okay, so that was my first scenario. My second scenario was a user who's got an organizational email, but they're not set up in Azure AD yet. So I'm using a tool called Mailinator that provides access to create test email addresses. So here's our Peter2 email that came through, and it's very much the same email that we saw previously, and I've got my Get Started link here. Now I'm not going to click that in this browser window because I'm already logged in with my corporate account. So let me just copy that link address. And I'm going to come over to Internet Explorer. Actually, this is going to get confusing. I need lots of different in-private windows. So let me load another in-private window. And I'm going to paste that link in. So I get to the same place. It provides much of the same information to me that I need, except it's telling me that I need to set up peter2@eum.co as an account with Microsoft. So it's already recognized that this account doesn't exist in Azure AD. I don't have credentials for it. We need to provision that. So now I go ahead and click Next here. And it's asking me to set up an account with Microsoft. So this is not a Microsoft account from a corporate point of view. This is actually an Azure AD tenant under the eum.co domain, and it's asking me to create a password for that account. So I go ahead and create that. Now it's sending me an email with a verification code just so it says I need to be 100% sure that you actually own that email address. So let's come back to our Mailinator window here. Here's our verification email that just came through and our code. Go ahead and paste that in the window here and finish. So it's a few more steps because I need to set up a password for this account. If I've forgotten this password later, I use the Azure AD screens to manage that process. And basically it's going to send password resets back to my email, similar to the verification code that we saw at the beginning here. So again, it's just setting things up and provisioning that account and then taking me through from there. So one of the things that we've recognized, we've just started rolling B2B out with a number of clients, is that we're going to need to provide some hand-holding to external users that maybe don't have the technical savvy to understand all the steps through this process. It's still a little bit complicated as you get onboarded through, and we're working to simplify that. Some of that's out of our control because it's part of the core Microsoft product from there. So let me just sign in as that peter2@eum.co account. I go ahead and use the password that I set in the previous process. And it's actually taking me into the Windows Azure portal. It's not where I really wanted to go. Similar problem to what we had before. So let's go to the eumdemo.sharepoint.com site, which is actually where I want to end up. Again, with control of the email invitation, we should be able to manage that process better. And now I can see I'm in that same Office 365 tenant, now logged in as this peter2@eum.co user. So that's the experience of coming in with an organizational account who's never been set up in Azure AD before. So let's go to the third scenario, which is I have a Gmail account. So I've created a brand new Gmail inbox this morning, and we can see here's my invitation to that. So same invitation again, and process through there. I can say get started. It's taking me through to the same page, but here again it's a slightly different message. It says you need to create a Microsoft account. So it recognizes that Gmail is a consumer domain, and it needs me to set that up as a full Microsoft account in order to come in. So I hit next on there. So it's taking me to different pages. Remember the previous one, I was going through Azure AD screens to set a password for that user. Here we're going to the Microsoft account side of things to set up that Microsoft account. Again, I need to set up a password with that. And similar process, it's sent a code for validation. So let's go back to my inbox here. I should see that come through shortly. There we go. So I grab that code, put it back in here. Now, for Microsoft accounts, they want to do a phone validation as part of that as well. So we need to prove that. So I'm actually going to have to use my phone. And I need a text message, so it's a little more involved again. 8053. And now we're back at the same end state. It's setting up my account, and ultimately it's probably going to take me to the wrong spot here again, but ultimately I'll be able to get into the umdemo.sharepoint.com site again through that. So that's the three experiences. The easiest is your external user is already an Office 365 user. Next step up in complexity, they have an organizational account. Last is they have a consumer email address and they haven't set up a Microsoft account. Now, if they already have a Microsoft account, obviously that sign-in experience becomes much easier as well through that. Okay. So let me just grab that email address. There we go. Because I'm not signing in through Azure AD, I'm signing in through the Microsoft account. It's going to take me over to that login and then over into my portal page. So at this point here, I can come to my demo site. Boom, there I am, logged in as that user in my Gmail account. So slightly different experiences through each of those three, depending on the type of users that you're bringing in. And that depends too on the type of extranet that you're building. I mean, if it's primarily a corporate portal where you're looking to partner with other businesses, then most of your users are either already going to have Azure AD accounts or they're going to have organizational email addresses. In fact, when B2B first launched, they didn't even allow you to come in through a Microsoft account or through a Gmail account. You had to use a business address. That was a new feature they added a couple months ago, so that's nice to see. All right, so that's our experience going through the out-of-the-box portal. Let's have a look at a couple other things while we're in here, though. I mentioned the company branding, so we're able to come in through here and actually edit the branding that we see in the page. So if you remember, the login form had this large sign-in page image. I can upload a new image through that. There's a banner image that shows up on those pages. That was also used on the email invitations we saw. There's some other text and logos that are used through other spots through there as well. So you have control over some of that branding experience. All right. So let's come back to our deck. Okay, so that's the out-of-the-box experience. Let's contrast that now from an Extranet User Manager perspective. Why would you want our product on top of that, and how does that change things from there? And really, from a B2B point of view, the main focus is around the delegation and the self-registration. Those are the two biggest things. I mean, the product supports on-premise accounts. There are lots of different scenarios. B2B is only one of them. But in the B2B specific one, that ability to delegate down to different groups of the users, and I'll show you how that works in a minute, is very critical there. And also the ability to do self-registration and approvals around that. The forgotten password reset actually doesn't apply to B2B because that's done through Azure AD. The simplified login, again, that's not from a B2B perspective, although it is in the product for other purposes. So if we look specifically around Extranet User Manager and B2B, so I mentioned the self-registration, the profile management, the delegation side of things. Basically what we're doing under the hood is as we're working in EUM, we're setting those users up in Azure Active Directory. So we're actually calling an API that Microsoft has provided to us to do that provisioning. Now, currently EUM doesn't send the invitation out. That's a feature we're just adding in now. That's going to be in our next release that's coming out in the next few weeks. Azure AD manages the login process. Extranet User Manager manages the group membership. That supports the delegation model from there. So let's have a look at some of the specific features of Extranet User Manager. So branding is very important. This is an example of not quite an on-premises. Kinross actually uses Azure to host a SharePoint 2013 portal. But again, having that branding experience in their case, from a login point of view, from an email perspective, from all the end users pages perspective, there's some limited control we have in B2B. There's certain pages that you see that Microsoft controls, but as much as we can control, we're aiming to do that, which is why we're taking the welcome email, the invitation email, and rolling that into Extranet User Manager. Self-registration being a big part of that. The idea that we can create a customized registration experience that can be used in a lot of different scenarios. So under the hood, it's actually its own Visual Studio project. We can fully customize that. We can integrate it into back-end systems. I mentioned things like Salesforce, Dynamics CRM are some of the examples where we've done that. We can change the fields. We can change the business rules around that. We can change the approval process around that. In fact, let's take a quick tour around and have a look at a few of those sites. So the one that was up on the slide deck there was for Public Health Ontario. This is a public site. It's actually built on SharePoint 2010. If we come into the registration link here, we can see the registration fields associated with that. So they've defined exactly what they want to appear here, and then when I save and continue, what the approval process is around that. If we go to another example, like the Ontario Association of Children's Aid Societies, they're a charitable organization. This is actually a SharePoint Online scenario. Oops, I need to do that in an in-private window. Hang on a second. I'm running out of different windows to use here. Let me go back to my IE session. I'll just sign out here. This is the problem with multiple tabs and different tenants, because we're not using B2B on the OCAS. That site actually went live earlier from that point of view. Let me just close right out. That's probably easier. Why is it doing that? I think I've completely confused my no, we're going to leave that one for now. Okay. What are some of the other ones that we want to have a quick look at? There's Boys and Girls Clubs of Canada. I mean, this is a nice example of back-end integration where, again, it's a SharePoint public-facing site for the organization across Canada, but members who belong to the clubs across Canada, there's 100 plus clubs, there's 700 different locations, a couple thousand members. They can register through here and go through an approval process, which is actually a little bit unique. So in this case, the registration process is actually asking them for the approval's email. Now the key is that approver has to already have an account themselves. So if I'm a member of the BGCC's members portal, somebody else can name me, and if I know them, I can vouch for them, approve them, and then they can then come in from there. Because the idea here was to make it very organic, very easy to onboard new people through there. So a couple different scenarios there from a registration point of view. The delegation idea, the idea that IT doesn't need to manage these accounts, you can delegate it to folks within your organization, but you can also delegate it externally to your organization. NAV Canada is one of our clients here in Canada. They're much like the FAA in the US. They work with all the various different airlines that operate into Canada, and they needed an extranet to be able to share security information related to that with each of those partners. What they do is they name an administrator at each of the partners, so say at an Air Canada or a WestJet, to say you are an administrator for your organization. That delegated user, even though they don't belong to NAV Canada, can then invite in additional users, make them members of their groups. So that idea of richly delegated models, not just within the organization, but external to the organization, is a big feature of the Extranet User Manager product. Adaptive design, so all the end user pages, the registration forms and such are built using the Bootstrap CSS framework, so they work well on smartphones, on tablets, as well as on desktops. The product can be hosted in Azure, or it can be installed on premises. A lot of our clients who are looking at B2B and want a fully hosted solution like the idea of us hosting that for them in Azure. We basically have a multi-tenant environment that we manage. We've got a third-party network operations center that provides 7/24 monitoring and remediation over that, so you don't need to run any of that infrastructure. But if you want to, you can install it on your own on-premises server. It can go on a SharePoint server. We recommend, though, putting it on its own separate IAS box. Doesn't need a lot of horsepower to run it, and away you go from there. The application is fully multilingual. We started English-French, being a Canadian company. That was obviously very important here. That Boys and Girls Club site I was showing you before is a good example of that. But all of the text in the application is managed through resource files, so you can actually update the translations, update the text copy yourself. We've had clients like Kinross who have translated it into half a dozen different languages from there. All right, So how much does it cost? How do we license the product? What does that look like? Well, we have two models I mentioned, the on-premise and the hosted. The on-premise is a traditional perpetual license, so it's a one-time fee, either 8,000 or 13,000 US dollars, based on whether it's a standard or enterprise edition. The difference there is how many systems are we authenticating to? Is it just going to one SharePoint farm? That would be a standard edition. We want to do single sign-on to multiple different applications. That would be an enterprise edition. Maybe we want to do hybrid where we want to authenticate to both SharePoint Online and on-premises SharePoint. That would be an enterprise edition. So that's the decision point between those. There is a 20% annual software assurance on top of that. That also provides rights for you to use the software from a development and a test point of view as well. So you don't need to purchase additional licenses, and it's a per farm or per installation charge. So it doesn't matter how many, say, web front ends you install it onto. If you've got high availability, a large clustered farm, it doesn't change the pricing from that point of view. On the flip side, in the hosted model, we roll everything into the hosting charges there. So all of your Azure charges, the license fees, the software assurance, the monitoring, remediation is all part of that, either $850 or $1,070 a month, depending, again, whether it's a standard or an enterprise version. All the details are fully published, so we're very public with how our pricing model works, and we try and keep it very simple. So have a look on our site there to get all the details there. Lots of different clients, different organizations. We have a number of different case studies up on our site, more coming from that point of view. I did want to mention a few different things on the governance side of things. We'll probably go fairly quickly through this just from a time point of view. Really, it comes back to, governance is a word that we hear a lot in SharePoint projects. What does it actually mean around defining roles and responsibilities and permissions and such? And thinking about how we apply permissions in SharePoint, we can apply them at different levels. Good governance says keep it at a fairly high level at the site level or at the list or library level. And then how we apply those permissions, this is where it comes into Extranet User Manager, is we can apply permissions directly to users or we can apply it to groups. And we're a big fan of applying permissions to groups and then managing the membership of that group. And here's the key point, is that we can differentiate between who manages permissions and who manages groups. If you want to turn on the external sharing in SharePoint Online, not the Azure AD one, what you're doing effectively is saying anybody who can invite users in can manage permissions. And that can become a bit of a Wild West. Your permissions get broken instead of inherited all over the place, and it starts to become difficult to understand where permissions are actually applied in SharePoint. What's better is to say, if an end user or a business unit needs a SharePoint site for some external collaboration, the site gets created for them, and maybe even have a site request form and a site creation process around that. They get the site, they get groups created that they can manage the membership of, but they don't actually control the permissions of the site itself. And that's where Extranet User Manager comes in. So let's have a look at some of those scenarios and what that would look like. The first thing I want to do, though, is come back to here and get rid of that account again that we created, just so I can go through that process one more time. So this time I'm going to clean it up in the Azure AD portal, this Peter at envisionit.com account. So let me just go ahead and delete that. And we're going to go through the process of creating that user through Extranet User Manager. So let's come back in here. So there's two sides to Extranet User Manager. There's an end user portion, and there's a more of an administration side to it as well. So let me actually start with the end user side of it. So I mentioned there's an out-of-the-box registration project that we provide. This is what it looks like. So this is our starting point, and then clients say to us, can you remove these fields that we don't want? Can you add in these additional fields, define the business rules and such from there? So we don't start fresh every time we start a new one. So this base out-of-the-box one here, I'm going to put my information in. I'm going to use that same corporate email address that I used for the previous demos. Leave the rest blank. It's optional. I do need to fill in the CAPTCHA here. Let's do that and go ahead and register. Oh, I'd already registered that user. Right. Bear with me. I didn't completely get rid of it the last time I was through here. So let's go through here. I deactivated the users, but it's still there as a deactivated user. What it's saying is really I should turn that user back on rather than create a new one. So now that it's gone, let's try that again. Just while that's spinning, so a little background on what was happening there. So we have the concept of a deactivated user. We tend to not like actually deleting users, because one of the things we do under the hood is keep a full audit trail of everything that's happening. So me registering here, when the approval happens, any changes to the profile, groups that I'm added to, removed from, all of that activity gets audited through the system, including the shutdown of my system when I'm deactivated. We don't want to actually delete that user record because we want to keep all that audit history. I've turned on a feature on the demo site that allows us to do that deletion just so we can purge out and repeat our demos. But from a production point of view, you'd want to leave that feature turned off. All right, so I've gone ahead and registered, and a couple of emails are getting generated out through this process right now. So one of them is going to go to me as the person that registered, and the other is going to go to me as an approver, because I'm kind of wearing both hats. So this is the first email to me as the person that registered saying, thanks for registering. Once I'm approved, I'm going to get more instructions from there. And then the other email is this one here that's saying, hey, a pending approval account is being created for Peter Carson. You need to edit their record. So let's go ahead and click on that link. And it's going to take me right into the admin console and show me all the information that was entered on that registration form. I can change and update this as an administrator if I want to, but really the main things that I want to do here is change their status from pending approval to Azure B2B. That's going to drive the invitation process, and I want to put them in that EUM SharePoint group, which under the hood is an Azure AD group. So I go ahead and save that, and that's now flowing through to Azure AD B2B. So I'm going to get another email, but this email is now going to come from Microsoft. Longer term, we're going to bring it out through the Extranet User Manager product. We'll take a minute while we're waiting for that email to show up, just to talk about the email configurations. So those two emails that we saw, the pending approval and the pending approver here, I can fully configure that. They can be plain text emails, or I can do full HTML formatting of that, which is what we've done here. And we can see there's things like the display name placeholder here. So you can define where you want those mail merge fields to appear in your email and control the branding and the experience around that. We do have a welcome email template. Currently it's used when we're creating an actual account for the users from an on-premises perspective rather than an Azure AD B2B. But we're planning on extending this and basically taking over that B2B invitation email, which is something that Microsoft supports through their API. Okay, so let's have a look here. I've got my invitation email. You're invited to the Envision IT organization. I can get started. And it's basically going to take me through that same process that we saw before, where I go through my redemption. And because this is already an Office 365 account that I'm using, it's going to be pretty quick and straightforward to take me through that process. Now, one of the things, even though we're not controlling the email invitation, because we invited through the API rather than through the portal, we do have a little bit more control over that invitation, and it does actually take me through to the eumdemo.sharepoint.com site that I wanted to come at the end of all that process. So it's a little slicker from that point of view. We want to take it that much further and have full control over what that email looks like. All right, so let's have a look back though at this site here and talk a bit more about some of the features in here. So right now I'm logged in as what's called a configuration editor, which means I've got full rights. I can change email templates. I can change my Office 365 configuration. There's lots of different things that I can do in here. There are two other roles in here as well, though. There's what's called a group editor and a group owner. So a group owner is the lowest level permission. Let's have a look at the groups in here for a second, though. So if I search and I see that EUM SharePoint group, so remember, under the hood, this maps to that same Azure AD group. I can open that up and I can see that I'm a member of that group. But I have a concept of being able to add an owner for that group as well. So when I add an owner, what it means is when that person comes into the portal here, all they see is the ability to search, add, and import users through here. They can't manage groups, they can't configure the system as a whole, but they can manage who belongs to their group. So that's a nice way of delegating down to users both within your organization and external to your organization. Now, if they've got a bulk set of users that they want to bring in, the Azure AD portal supports the bulk import, but it's actually in the old portal. It's a pretty confusing process to use. So if you want your business users to be able to easily create, say, an Excel file imported in, basically they download the template, they populate it, they load it up, it'll go through a validation step, and then they go, and those users get imported in and put into the appropriate groups from there. So we do have a nice way to streamline the bulk load of those users. Or they can add an individual group in through here. Now, right now, because I'm a configuration editor, I'm seeing all of the groups. But let's say I was just an owner of SharePoint. That's the only one that I would be able to add to the users. All the other groups wouldn't appear to me because I'm not an owner of those groups. Now, the other thing is around the user search side of things. So right now, we don't have a lot of users in the system. I cleaned it out before I did the demo this morning, but I'm seeing all of the users that are available to me. We can configure this to say, you know what, for those delegated users, they're only going to be able to search and edit users that belong to a group that they own. This is really important when you're delegating externally. If you think back to that Nav Canada example, you wouldn't want somebody at Air Canada to be able to search a WestJet user and deactivate them and shut them out of the Nav Canada portal. That's a clear issue from a security point of view. You'd want those Air Canada folks to only be able to manage the users at Air Canada that belong to their group. So we have that ability through there to further refine how that delegation works. And then I mentioned the other role was a group editor. Basically, if I come in as a group editor, I don't see all these configuration options, but in addition to managing users, I see the ability to add and search groups as well. So I can add a net new group through here. Let's just call this Jan 25 webinar. I can add members to it if I want. So let's do a quick search and add that Peter Carson user into that and say OK. And under the hood, it's creating that Azure AD group and it's adding that user to that group. So if we come back to one of our many browser windows here, so let's look at our all groups. So we can see there's our Jan 25th webinar that we just created. It wasn't there before. We can see there's one member in there. Who's that? Peter, external user. So I didn't need to come into the Azure AD portal to do any of that. I was able to do all of that group and all of that user management right through the Extranet User Manager portal itself. So that's a quick tour through the EUM side of things. We went deeper into the Extranet User Manager in last week's webinar because of the features from an on-premise point of view. So if you're curious more about that, by all means have a look at that. Or if you prefer, reach out to Logan. We'd love to do a one-on-one demo, explore your scenario a little bit more, and go deeper from that point of view. So let me just come back to my PowerPoint here. So we've gone through the demo already. Those are the URLs. You can actually click those links yourself. There's no auto approval, so you'll be left in a pending approval state, but you can go through that part of the process. And basically that's wrapping up from there. We're pretty much out of time. I want to do a quick poll here just to get a sense from what you've seen here so far. How do you see leveraging Azure AD B2B? Is it specifically to bring external users into Office 365, or is there other SaaS applications that you're interested in using it with? What about your own, maybe you've got custom applications that are wired into Azure AD, or maybe you've got on-premise applications that you're interested in connecting through the Azure application proxy. And this will help us understand, future webinars, where do we want to target in? There's some other topics that are quite interesting here that we want to dive down into. Okay, I'll give you another 10 seconds or so just to wrap up the last on that. Okay. So as I mentioned, Logan is your go-to guy from a sales follow-up point of view. So if you want to schedule a deeper technical demo, do you want to create a hosted trial, which we can set up for you? We can connect that to your Azure AD, to your Office 365 if you want to do it from a live proof of concept point of view. Or if you'd like to actually have an evaluation copy installed on premises, we can do that as well. So lots of options going forward from there. Just a couple other notes on upcoming. We've got a webinar we're doing in partnership with B&R Business Solutions down in the US. That's happening February 23rd. It's covering sort of a combination of last week's and this week's. We're going to look at both on-premise and Office 365. And then I'm going to be speaking and exhibiting down at SharePoint Engage in Phoenix in March and SharePoint Fest in April. So if you're at either of those conferences, by all means come by, say hi. I'm happy to have a deeper conversation from there. From there, I think we're pretty much at the noon hour. I want to thank everybody for joining us today. As I mentioned, the recording and the slide deck will be up on our site shortly, and we'll send a follow-up email to everybody just to let them know about that. Thanks for joining me today, and have a great rest of your day.